when it comes to the management of AKI, I mean, I will only outline the broad principles of the management of AKI. First, identify the treatable causes. Look at hypovolemia. Look at putative nephrotoxic drugs. Look at obstruction. Look at any compromise or any changes in the hemodynamic parameters, the cardiac output, are we dealing with a low cardiac output state? Are we dealing with an intra-abdominal hypertension? Are we looking at a hypoalbuminemic state? You identify the treatable causes first. You withdraw the nephrotoxic agents. You adjust the doses of renally cleared drugs. Now, this is another point. It itself will take a big seminar again on how you adjust the dose of renally cleared drugs. In the intensive care unit, when a patient has AKI, the drug dosing we use is not the same as what you read in literature about CKD patients. The drug dosing in AKI is a different kettle of fish when compared to the literature which studies stable CKD patients who are on 3 days a week of dialysis. In those patients, the drug disposition is totally different. In the intensive care unit, the drug dosing which you use has got a lot of influence on the volume of distribution, the albumin level, and therefore the protein binding of the drug, the modality of the RRT which you are using, the duration of the RRT which you are using, and the clearance which you are trying to achieve. So if somebody is on CRRT, for example, the dose of drugs like carbapenems and cephalosporin should be given in the full dose. Whereas if somebody is on a 12 hours of renal replacement therapy, your dosing schedule should be dependent upon the PK/PD characteristics of the drug vis-a-vis its drug elimination. The common mistake which we make in the intensive care unit is to extrapolate CKD data or data about drug dosing in renal failure, which is from CKD population, and bring it into an AKI patient who is on a hybrid mode of renal replacement therapy. This does several things. One, it underdoses the patient. Second, it sets the tone for subtherapeutic effect of the antimicrobial which we are using. So while we know that the pharmacological classification is there of cephalosporins, beta lactams, and macrolides, aminoglycosides, in the intensive care unit you divide them into time dependent, concentration dependent, and both time and concentration dependent antimicrobials. And this concept extends to antifungals also. So I cannot discuss all these things, but we should be able to adjust the dose of renally cleared drugs appropriately. One of the important determinants of adverse outcomes in acute kidney injury is the management of potassium. This is an important electrolyte which has bearing on your outcomes and your decision to initiate renal replacement therapy for patients. Optimizing the mean arterial pressure has always been the goal of intensive care practice, and more so in patients who have pre-renal uh, problems. Volume status. There is nothing you can do in an empty tank. So unless you optimize your volume status, whether I give noradrenaline, whether I give dobutamine, whether I give furosemide, whether I give albumin to the patient is not going to work unless my intravascular volume status is properly assessed and is optimized by whatever techniques we know. Correcting the acidosis is an important step for the management of acute kidney injury, and I am not a believer in giving bicarb for the correction of acidosis. I would like to hear from Dr. Chakravarti about this.
So, so whenever you think of bicarbonate, I think you should please consider that there is a lot of sodium going along with it. So if somebody is fluid overloaded and you are struggling to get the fluid out, giving bicarb does not make sense. So soda bicarbonate IV should be used in a very, very rare condition wherein you do not have access to other forms of correction of acidosis. And I would go on a early renal replacement therapy or correction of acidosis. There is some data even from Indian subcontinent when acidosis was used as the trigger, the outcomes of the ICU were much, much better. So I believe IV soda bicarbonate has no role unless you do not have an access to a renal support in the. So any good unit should not be using IV soda bicarbonate.
Also, if the the acidosis is so bad, generally he would be having the other indications also, potassium going up, fluid overload, and stuff like that. You won't have isolated severe acidosis. I mean, that's the way to look at it. Another way to look at it. And at the same time, there was a Bicura trial recently. I don't know whether you went through it. There, they showed some benefit of using soda bicarb for correcting acidosis due to renal failure vis-a-vis lactic acidosis. In lactic acidosis, definitely bicarb does not help. Once there is lactic acidosis falling to 7.2 or below, you should do dialysis or treat the underlying cause. But in metabolic acidosis due to renal failure, there was some benefit with soda bicarb. But at the same time, like sir said, if there is significant acidosis, then you should go for dialysis because of the various reasons sir said.
And you tend to choose the mode and the dose of RRT. So what is the hemodynamic status of the individual? How well will he tolerate the mode of RRT we are using? What is your priority or predominant indication for initiating the RRT should help you to choose the mode and the dose of RRT. This again will be a topic of a separate session, so I'm not going to go into more details, although I'll put up one slide on that. Management of phosphate is another important thing. If you remember that our biochemistry, phosphate is the energy currency in the body. It is a component of the energy currency in the body. And in a period of stress, like critical illness, hypophosphatemia is an independent determinant of adverse outcome among patients with acute kidney injury. So management of phosphate is now an integral part of management of acute kidney injury, but importantly, avoid second hit, avoid contrast again and again for a patient, avoid nephrotoxic agents in a septic patient, avoid second hits, avoid hypotension again in a septic patient. Something very similar to what happens in neurological practice. A little bit of modalities of RRT which are available. We have CRRT, we have SLED, and we have intermittent hemodialysis. Depending upon what you are targeting, you know that the dose of dialysis can be different in different forms of renal replacement therapy. If the patient is hemodynamically stable, then your intermittent hemodialysis has a role. But that is not the normal situation in ICU practice. So you need to be looking at hybrid forms of renal replacement therapy, either a continuous form or a prolonged intermittent renal replacement therapy. And when you do that, you also need to be looking at your anticoagulation to prolong the filter life. So there is something called as an AKI bundle. I'll finish quickly. I think Dr. Chakravarti has got another commitment. We will not hold him back for long. Another 2 minutes, sir, I will finish. So there is something called as an AKI bundle. That is when you, just as you have a VAP bundle, you have a stress ulcer prophylaxis bundle, you have DVT bundle, you have a acute kidney injury bundle, where you assess the history and examine. Look at the volume status, look at the history, look at nephrotoxins, use a urine dipstick, come to a clinical diagnosis, use appropriate investigations, and treat the patient. Optimize the perfusion pressures, treat the underlying cause, monitor the volume status and daily volume status of the individual, and prevent complications. Most importantly, we should get into the habit of seeking advice. People who manage acute kidney injury should always have a teamwork with the nephrologist, and we should try to have an approach in which the priorities of intensivists are in sync with the thought process of the nephrologist in order to achieve a good quality patient care. So the last slide is something which I always teach my students to remember, which Dr. Chakravarti always points out whenever we have a talk about AKI. That AKI is a risk factor for CKD in future, even if somebody has recovered 100%. So if you look at patients over a period of time, and this is the insult, over a period of time, you have patients who can progress to ESRD. You can have patients who are acute or chronic kidney disease, or you can have patients who AKI to CKD. This is the biggest subset of patients who emerge out of the intensive care unit when they did not have any kidney problem. They develop acute kidney injury. Whether or not they require renal replacement therapy, only 20 to 25% will go with a full recovery with no chances of chronic component in future. But the remaining 75% of the patients will end up in this category. Sir, your comments on this. This is one of your favorite slides, I know, but I can't resist asking you your comments on this question.
So the good thing is this was a cartoon which was accepted by International Society of Nephrology when the understanding that every country CKD burden, nearly 25% of the CKD burden comes from recurrent AKI. So what Srinivas tried to tell you, majority of your AKI from the ICU is actually going to end up after a couple of months as a CKD. These concepts are extremely clear now, and actually we know the pathogenesis or pathophysiology of how a AKI becomes a CKD. We will not have time to discuss all that. There are 3 different mechanisms identified, and there are people looking at how to make these mechanisms mitigated so that a AKI does not become a CKD. Just to summarize, when you have one insult, the common understanding between you and me is that this is a single organ disease. What we now know is AKI is not a single organ disease. It's a multi-systemic disease. The minute AKI is established, there are changes seen in each of the other organs. There are changes in the lung, there are changes in the bone, there are changes in the liver and changes in the heart. And we now know there are changes in the bone marrow. That is the reason when you have a AKI a little prolonged, you start getting significant amount of anemia and other things. So they also know what is the exact molecule or cytokine which is affecting each of these organs. And we clearly know now when you have a AKI for a couple of weeks, you have a insulin resistance which sets in the body forever for the rest of your life. So your new onset diabetes is more after one AKI episode. Your new onset heart failure is more, or heart disease is more. New onset sepsis is more. Number of times patient comes back to hospital for other reasons is more. Their mortality at the end of 2 years is also more. So this understanding has now brought us to the fact that it's a multi-systemic disease and it needs to be followed up. So what you do in the ICU, when you do, and how you treat these patients actually determines whether your patient is falling into that full recovery category or the other 3. So a little more knowledge and interaction, as Srinivas told, I think is basic to how our patients fare. And follow up, as the one concept probably we didn't have time to reach was AKI is labeled up to 7 days. But beyond 7 days, there is a new term now called AKD, acute kidney disease. So acute kidney disease, when you label them, when they get discharged from ICU into hospital, hospital into the community, they need to be followed up like any other CKD patients. And there are some strategies you put into place so that AKI doesn't go into AKD, does not go into CKD at the end of 90 days. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that was the icing on the cake.
Yeah, wonderful. Doctor,
So,
do you have to go because, or will you stay for another 15-20 minutes before we finish?
I would like to take leave.
Sir, okay.
Thank you.
So we would just like to thank you, sir, from my side. Words of wisdom, experience, and gold and silver, everything together, sir. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll have a lecture from you and see you again on this platform. Thank you for educating all.
Thank you, sir.
No, it is what I learned from all of you all over the years.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So carry on. I think Dr. Sambhajan, please carry on.
So we discontinue all the nephrotoxins whenever possible. We ensure volume status and perfusion pressures as happens as a core principle of intensive care. We consider functional hemodynamic monitoring when cardiac output is an issue as far as renal hypoperfusion is concerned. Hyperglycemia is another determinant of adverse outcome in acute kidney injury, and we should be very particular about it. We should consider alternatives to radio contrast procedures, and diagnostic workup is also we have already discussed. So this is a summary of the management of acute kidney injury. So just go back to my patients in the ICU. I'll just tell you what's happening today. Now, this particular gentleman had a contrast CT with a proper hydration. He's doing well. His output is steady at more than 50 ml per hour, and the latest blood gas does not show any major causes for concern. The second lady unfortunately ended up with anuria. She had to be put on renal replacement therapy, but her hemolysis worsened, and we had to offer her therapeutic plasma exchange as well. And she did well after therapeutic plasma exchange and made a good recovery. This particular gentleman actually was given the furosemide stress test. He responded well initially to the furosemide stress test, but slowly became oliguric again to the point that we were contemplating invasive ventilation on this gentleman. So he was put on slow continuous ultrafiltration using a CRRT machine for 48 hours, and he recovered back to his creatinine of 1.4. So these different patients with different problems ended up with different interventions with reasonable results. So in summary, AKI is a syndrome caused by a spectrum of different etiological factors. It has many significant consequences on patient outcome, both short term and long term. Early recognition of AKI provides an opportunity to improve the patient outcomes through appropriate interventions. Whatever said and done, optimizing hemodynamics and volume status is of paramount importance in patients with acute kidney injury. There is no definite treatment for acute kidney injury, and as with all aspects of medicine, prevention is always better than a cure. Doing no harm is first rather than undoing harm to the patient, and choosing the appropriate mode of RRT probably is also an essential step in the management of these patients. So
Thank you, sir. Sir, is that all? I think okay. So, friends, that was a wonderful piece of information discussion. Dr. Srinivas Amidan, thank you so much. Right from the top of intensive care of India, and my friends, you have enjoyed that. Please put your questions, and let me just start with our panels. Of course, first we'll discuss contrast. Ritesh, sir, please ask your question to Dr. Mehta. You had some question about the contrast. He'll answer that.
Yes, actually, there are lots of discussion and mixed literature regarding that the ionic, non-ionics, maybe less ionic or something like that. Choosing the contrast. Omnipac versus Visipac, long awaited debate. Over and above hydration, soda bicarb and non-NAC, and So what's your routine practice? Suppose if you find creatinine, do you use preferably, specific contrast to prevent further kidney injury or something? You are muted, sir.
Dr. Mehta, you are muted.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, I'll tell you that now that the NABH has introduced this standard that we have to use EGFR as the criteria and not the creatinine as the criteria, because there are so many times patients who are elderly, who are thin, of less weight, their creatinine could be within the normal range, but their EGFR could be abnormal. So we have introduced this, and I think most of the NABH hospitals have introduced this, that the technicians are ensuring that they do the EGFR calculations before they go ahead and take a patient for a contrast study. Otherwise, they're going to hold the patient and involve the radiologist, and then we talk to the ICU doctors and we take a call on the basis of the urgency of that particular situation. And whenever we have to take a case, say if the EGFR is between 45 to 60, in that condition, we do use Visipac, which is actually just, it's not yet fully proven that it has any definite advantage over the previously used Omnipac. But this is that's the best that we have with us. So Visipac is the one we are using vis-a-vis, but we have seen patients falling sick even on Visipac too. So it is not like sacrosanct, but you are very safe with it.
And sir, I
But
did contrast anaphylaxis also in the CT room. I think code blue occurs not so infrequently in the CT room or when you give the contrast. The anaphylaxis, severe anaphylaxis can occur, and the patient is already sick. So we have had some code blues in the CT room when you give the contrast. I don't know about your hospital.
Yeah, we haven't had any as frequent contrast reactions to. I think it's related to also the batches that you get. So what we have a contrast allergy policy also, that if there are more than 2 cases from the same batch of contrast media, you have more than 2 cases who are having minor reactions, then we raise the bogey with our the store department of our hospital, and they cross check with the other labs. If anyone else has also reported any allergic reaction to the same batch, then we ensure that that particular batch is withdrawn, and we don't use that particular batch.
Thank
So
you,
there,
yeah. Dr. Jitendra sir, thank you. Anything else? Dr. Jitendra sir, your comments now. We'll just take the comments from the panel. And
yeah, just in continuation to the code blue in city room, we almost never had a code blue just because of the contrast reaction. Point number one, Dr. Mehta already said a good screening part. And second is the system is very well placed for the how to deal with the allergic reaction. Third is almost all patient who goes for contrast study from ICU is actually accompanied by the one of the doctor or one of the trained person who deal with all the ICU patient. We anticipate this. So somehow we have a code blue, but not because of the contrast.
That is good, but you cannot predict. Sometimes there is anaphylaxis. Once once in a year you get anaphylaxis, and these patients are really sick. So if you are not getting that, means there's a very good quality control in your radiology department. But in those hospitals where the quality control is not that good, once in a while you get a code blue because they cause severe.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, so we'll move on now.
And before closing, just I wanted to reiterate 2 things. That is one from the science aspect as well as from the medico-legal aspect also. So, holding of the contrast study for the fear of the contrast-induced kidney injury in those patients who require acute care as well as the life-threatening situation where you need to have a diagnosis as well as the answer which can change your line of treatment. Please don't hold on the contrast study just to fear of the acute kidney injuries related to the contrast situation in the critical ill patient. And second is, as Dr. Srinivas has also pointed out, dosing of drugs, by and large all drugs, but more emphasis on the antibiotic or antimicrobial. Dosing on the estimated creating clearance and reduction of dose, one should be very careful that rather I would like to keep a little bit overdosing in comparison to the estimated creating clearance in the acute kidney injury, because it is not the only the creating clearance. There's significant literature showed altered.
I would just like to interrupt here. You made a very valid point. Just I want to interrupt. It is very clearly written now in no other book other than Brenner's Nephrology, a latest edition, that for the first 48 hours in the critically ill patients, do not change the dose of antibiotics. That is a very, very valid point.
Exactly.
And I think one of the significant points from this
and
48 hours.
Even in maintenance phase, because drug dosing also depends upon the correctly pointed out by Dr. Srinivas is the albumin level as well as the volume of the solution.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. So that was one message. I will move on to the panelist. Dr. Pritesh, your answer is question is answered. Any comments now? Final comments on anything on acute kidney injury?
Yeah, I would say that it's I teach my students with AKI in ICU is kind of 3Ds. The risk factors, over and above the risk factors, the disease, the development of any event, and drugs. These 3 things need to be taken care of over and above the risk factors. So that's Srinivas has done wonderful job in his presentation, summarized in a very brief way, but brief but elaborative, I would say.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Vidya, sir. Wonderful comments, and we know you are doing wonderful job in Gujarat and taking care of the teaching in Gujarat. Thank you, sir. Ma'am, you like to say anything from your side?
Yes, sir, I would like to say this to Srinivasa. So I work in NIGRIMS in Shillong. It is a central institute, government institute. So I have seen with my experience is that we get these very young patients, female patients, who come to us with acute kidney injury from history point of view, which goes into a picture of RPGN. So the thing is that we've been having a lot of these emergency presentation of autoimmune disease, for which with the history and with the age factor, we usually have a high risk of suspicion, though the workup for them usually to point out that they really have these emergency presentation of autoimmune disease do take some time, but the action need to be taken a bit fast. But from critical care point of view, I have not seen that chapter of autoimmune disease presentation as in emergency cases has not been emphasized yet. Whether this will be emphasized, needs to be emphasized, I want to ask your opinion, sir.
Definitely, yes. We have seen a lot of catastrophes related to the autoimmune diseases, renal pulmonary syndromes, alveolar hemorrhages, some patients coming with rapidly progressing renal failure, young ladies especially. It is probably underdiagnosed. You know, we probably in the heat of the battle, we know we have to dialyze these patients. We do it and hand over to the nephrologist, and we forget about what's happening. But as you said, the diagnosis sometimes takes a lot of time. It's not straightforward. So what you miss in your first instance, you may actually have to do it when the situation is a little more stable in the long term. But yes, it needs to be given proper attention, and that's where I cannot overemphasize the value of a properly done urine examination. So what happens is, when a patient comes to the emergency room, a urine examination is sent away, right? But we look at the ABG, we look at cultures, we look at LFT, we look at coagulation parameters, but we overlook the CUE. Now the CUE, despite all the advances in science, it is an index into what's happening into the kidney. It is probably still got its relevance in the intensive care unit. Is there protein loss? Is there hematuria? Are there active casts in the urine? In a young lady who comes to us with unexplained renal failure, this could be make or break. So I think what you said is particularly a very valid point.
Yes. Thank you, sir. I think those are very wonderful words. Urine examination. We are talking about acute kidney injury, and we cannot not talk about urine examination. So, ma'am, I would just like to say here that about treating these patients. Like sir said, Dr. Samejan, that the ultimate diagnosis would take time in terms of what kind of etiology it is. But when you have RPGN coming in, suspected RPGN, then you have to look at the urine and look at the nephritic sediment. The differential diagnosis for nephritic sediment should be clear to you, to all of us, right? Once you get a nephritic sediment in terms of proteinuria, 2+, 3+, or a lot of RBCs, WBCs, you're dealing with the inflammatory kidney. The glomeruli are inflamed, and you have a RPGN or AGN also, depending on how acute or how subacute it is. And from there on, you make the diagnosis, and you send your C3, C4, you send your ANA, you send your ANCA, and that can come back in 3-4 days. And subsequently, once you get a clinical diagnosis of nephritis, you look at the lung also, but the lung and the kidney are often involved together in these syndromes. It's a pulmonary renal syndrome, most of these. And then you make a diagnosis whether it's lupus, whether it's a vasculitis, whether it's antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, whether it's an idiopathic RPGN, and you give your steroids or your whatever drug you have, or rituximab. You have these options of high-dose methylprednisolone or IVI, not IVI, your immunosuppressants. So then you wait for your confirmatory diagnosis in terms of C3, C4, P-ANCA, C-ANCA, ANA, and so on and so forth. And there's a differential. I don't know. I'm sure you being a medicine background, you'll be knowing the approach to these patients. But you are right. There's not so much emphasis, and because one of the reasons is these are not so common. Also, if you look at the volume, these patients are not so common, and you have the rheumatologists and all following up, so they kind of see these patients. But the point here is you are in Northeast where you may not have so much specialized services. So you may be getting more of these patients directly to you, and the incidence of these autoimmune diseases is more in Northeast. The incidence
Yes, sir.
of autoimmune
Yes, sir. And the thing is that And the thing is that our population doesn't come to the hospital when they have mild or moderate disease. They come only when they have the severe form of disease.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Yeah. So I think that is because that is I understand your problem there. Anyway,
Yes, sir.
I
Thank
think-
you, sir.
any comments from you, ma'am? Anything else you want to say or ask? Anything else?
That's all, sir, from my side.
Okay. So I think we'll just, I'd just like to say a few things, basic things, because Dr. Chakravarti sir had spoken some golden words, trials and the cutting edge. And Dr. Srinivas Samadan sir has presented a very extensive view and wonderful slides across the breadth and depth of AKI. And there are topics which need to be covered definitely. So, my friends, a few things about physiology, basic physiology you should know. First of all, 20% of the cardiac output goes to the kidney at any time. Second, how much urine is produced per day on an average and how much is filtered through. You will get an overview of the kidney. One, in a normal physiology, 180 liters of blood is filtered through to produce 2 liters. That is 99% gets absorbed. This is normal physiology. You can then kind of estimate what is going wrong in your patient. Now you have 2 liters of urine being produced, and in this you get your sodium also. So how much is the daily sodium 150 milliequivalent is consumed daily in terms of 10 grams. So you get 150 milliequivalents of sodium going through in 2 liters of urine. So you get around 75 to 100 milliequivalents of sodium per liter in an average adult, right? Similarly, your potassium and your other electrolytes, which are required sometimes in hypokalemia, hyponatremia, and even in your estimation of AKI. Then urine examination, we've already discussed. We come to pus cells. It's a very frequent question. I've been asked, how do you diagnose UTI? So up to 5 pus cells are normal. On a catheterized sample, 5 is also possible, and cultures can also be positive. So on a catheterized sample, it has no meaning the number of cells, and cultures positively, you have to correlate. Do not treat positive cultures all the time. You have to correlate clinically on a catheterized sample whether the patient has UTI or not. If the patient on the catheter has a positive culture, no pus cells, it is unlikely to be UTI, because UTI leads to AKI all the time. Either they come from outside or it develops in the ICU. So this should be clear to everybody. Then the other thing is about blood urea. There's a question on blood urea. So what is the role of blood urea in AKI? We've been talking about creatinine. Blood urea is the one which actually causes most of the problems. Of course, the other molecules are also retained. Now, the first important thing is a blood urea greater than 200 is a soft trigger for your dialysis. That is one. Secondly, blood urea ratio. The ratio of blood urea to creatinine helps in telling you whether you can give fluids, whether it is prerenal. And the ratio is taken as blood urea to creatinine over 40. It is not sacrosanct. Okay, but blood urea to creatinine ratio, simple test. When the patient comes to you, if your urea to creatinine ratio is more than 40, means it is prerenal, he is likely to respond to fluids. And along with this, you can do your urine sodium. Urine sodium less than 20. That means that he can respond to fluids. And I have used this. This works very well, initially at least. Simple test. But if the patient is old, already having Lasix or pre-existing disease, then this will not work. So that is about urea. And the higher the urea, more the systemic complications. Urea is an ineffective osmole. It goes through all the cells, all the membranes, intracellular, extracellular, and the urea removal in RRT leads to dialysis disequilibrium. So I think that is something we can tell about urea. Your thrombocytopenic dysfunction correlates to urea. So that is about urea. I understand why you asked about urea, because all the time you're talking about creatinine, and AKI is not only creatinine, it is also uremia. So it is all about uremia, uremic pericarditis, uremic encephalopathy, uremic platelet dysfunction, and that's I think should be enough for urea. And I think that's about all from my side. A few basic things, and please assess the fluid status when you want to hydrate. If the patient is not passing urine, don't go on giving fluids, because it is detrimental. It actually worsens the kidney function. Assess for fluid responsiveness. Use your history. Use your blood urea to creatinine ratio. Use your urine sodium, and then you can use your probe or whatever, PLRT or whatever you have. And if the patient, you're giving fluids and he starts passing urine, that does not mean he's improving. Please be cognizant of this also. If you start giving urine, a lot of fluids, and after 6-8 hours he starts trickling urine, it is not necessary that he is improving. He might be going into non-oliguric renal failure. You have to look at the creatinine. We have talked about oliguric and non-oliguric. So when you give fluids, patient starts passing urine, it is likely he's improving. At the same time, one should be aware, one has to see the creatinine also, because he can be going into non-oliguric renal failure and producing the urine. So I think that's about it from my side. I think there are no more questions also. It has been a prolonged session. It is almost 2.5 hours. But since everybody is sitting, and I think we have been able to kind of help you with our inputs in acute kidney injury, especially from Dr. Srinivas Amidan sir and from Rajshankar Chakravarti, and of course Dr. Radiology sir, Dr. Mehta sir, who has joined in and given us valuable inputs. All the way from Shillong, ma'am has joined us, and Dr. Ritesh from Gujarat, and Dr. Jitendra sir, who is always there with us as faculty, and Dr. Srinivas Amidan also, who is there with us as faculty. So I think Samidan sir, final word, sir.
We have summarized, I think you have summarized everything, but a high index of suspicion, a meticulous attention to the routines of intensive care, a meticulous maintenance of the fluid balance, and avoiding second hits is the key to preventing and managing a care. Is all I can say.
Okay, guys, then thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Close.
Thank you, sir. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.